Resume recording. Did it tell you it's recording?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. It's a funny little voice, isn't it? I think what we've heard a lot of this word justice in junior school is around like justice in the court system and justice, you know, you deserve justice and they got justice, those victims. And in this context that we're talking about at this term, we're really talking about something a little bit different to that criminal law sort of legislation justice. We do talk about that though, again, which kind of blurs into this grey space because we do talk about criminal justice as well. But justice, when we talk about criminal justice, is kind of twofold. So it's going to be the justice that I'm going to sort of talk to you about today, and then also justice as in criminal justice. But that's after we look at education. First of all, we get a big broad overview of social justice throughout the world and what that looks like. To start off with, I'm going to just go through a few concepts and definitions, mostly around citizenship, human rights, and that's what our work on the style page is going to be about this week. So just really kind of dipping our toe in the very broader overview and understanding of what this is going to be all about, and then being able to talk about the stuff that sits underneath that. I'll share this with you. I'll put it on the bottom of our style page or at the top, whatever takes my fancy, once we're finished tonight. So please don't feel like you have to rush and write it all down. I'd rather you talk about it and then interrupt me and, you know, ask me something or say, oh, I don't agree with that, or what does this mean? So definitely do that instead of feeling like you have to write things down, okay? All right, the first one I want to talk about is this whole idea of citizenship rights. And it comes from, so you can see that the definition there is the fact you have rights just because you are a citizen of a particular place. It also means that people expect you to be a responsible member of that community. So you get the rights for being part of that particular community, but also that community expects you to give them back those rights in terms of being a good person in society. So that's how we can sort of define the concept of citizenship rights. And then the examples we're going to look at, because throughout this we'll look at Australian examples, and because we're looking at a global perspective, we'll look at an international example all the time as well. So the Australian example of not having citizenship rights and what that looks like was terra nullius. So saying that there was no one owning the land belonged to nobody, which meant that Aboriginal people had no rights. They weren't a citizen of a particular place. So they didn't feel like they needed to be a responsible member of that society. So there's twofold there in terms of what happened during colonisation. Those rights were re-established only so recently. 1967 referendum, which was nearly 200 years later after terra nullius was declared. So that meant that Aboriginal Australians didn't have any rights at all under government legislation until 1967. I was saying today to the internal students, so my parents, I don't deem them that old, because hopefully I don't think that I'm too old myself, but my parents were 10 before, you know, some of their friends here in Kempsey were actually considered to be Australian citizens. So they were 10, they were older than my eldest daughter now, so they really would have known and be really aware of this difference in terms of citizenship rights, even here in Kempsey especially. Just being, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not long ago that Aboriginal Australians, they were counted as flora and fauna. And instead of being part of the census, they were counted by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So hopefully that kind of gives you an example of citizenship rights and what can happen if they're not given. The international example that we'll use here, and some of you used this this particular Native American tribe for your comparative study in year 11. They maintained citizenship rights, so they were never stripped of their rights in terms of their land wasn't deemed terra nullius. They've maintained their rights, however, there has been a trade-off with their rights, and part of their treaty was that they would agree to move to Indian reserves, an Indian state as such, what that did mean is that the state was run by America as a whole, not the individual state that mission was in. So the laws that applied were across the whole of America, and they were often quite a lot more severe than the individual state laws. So even though the rights remained and treaty was given, it doesn't necessarily mean that the citizenship rights as we imagine them today, that people will automatically have those rights and that they will then participate in that society freely as well. The second one is treaty rights, and this one's really interesting because we are one of the only countries that doesn't have a treaty with our First Nations people. So hopefully we all remembered that information, and that Australia has never signed a treaty, and that all ties in with Aboriginal Australians never having ceded their sovereignty, and we'll get to sovereignty after this one. So treaty rights are the rights that are reserved by Indigenous people when they sign treaties with settler societies in the wake of colonisation. Oh, and I have noticed that switched that back to that terrible Z that it likes to throw in. So, oh wow, on a roll over here, guys. Look, promise I'll fix that up before I put it on style. So the Australian example of a treaty is that there isn't one. So we don't have a treaty. We've never had a treaty. We have talked in the past. So the treaty example I've got here is from the Sioux Native Americans again. They did make a treaty. The treaty was ignored and broken, which allowed the processing of resources on their land. And of course, the Sioux being moved into missions and reserve. The other one I want you to remember is that the Maori had a treaty as well when they were colonised, and we can hopefully can sort of remember that that happened after Australia was colonised, and the Europeans sort of I think understood a little bit more about what maybe what not to do, but also the Maori had the I guess you could say the kings of their tribe as the Europeans could see it in their eyes, and they could see that there was someone that they could make a treaty with, whereas Aboriginal Australia didn't have that hierarchy and that society that resembled Europeans at all. So there are lots of reasons historically why a treaty wasn't established in 1770. That's a few of them, but in terms of not being established since then, very, very, very political discussion around what saying yes to a treaty might mean. The example, and we still didn't have an answer after we discussed this today, and I'd be really happy to hear from you two tonight. The example I gave was here where I live in Smithtown. I own my house and a block of land. Very happy with that. Worked hard to buy that, cost a bit of money. However, I think people are afraid of and have this concept and idea that if a treaty is signed, we are in fact saying that terra nullius didn't exist, which we know it didn't. But going back to the analogy, so I've paid for this property, and I paid the person who owned it before me, and they paid the person who owned it before them, who I guess initially bought it from the council, who divided up the land and decided that this is where a town was going to be. But the council never owned it originally and to sell it to that first person. So I guess what I'm saying in a roundabout way is that I think sometimes people are afraid that signing a treaty and agreeing that sovereignty was never ceded might mean that Aboriginal Australia might come and take away everyone's properties. So there's a discussion to be had there. I don't know if there's a solution. Some of the things we came up with was, obviously my family and I need somewhere to live, but it wasn't someone's land to sell in the first place 200 years ago, or any time since then, whenever it was bought. Perhaps then it turns more into compensation, perhaps not from the individual, but from the rights, from the rates that I pay, each year to have my property here. So did any ideas pop into your heads while I was sort of giving that analogy of a treaty, and perhaps why people Australia in general might be scared of it. But I think why we need a treaty more than that is not as a token or a gesture, but really to say, yeah, look, this was the last 200 years were quite wrong. There were things that happened that weren't okay, and they happened because this treaty didn't exist in the first place. Your rights were never acknowledged. Therefore, there was no law against breaking them during that time. So a lot of words there, I know, but what do you guys think?
Do you reckon with like that land council thing, do you reckon that happened in like for the Native Americans and New Zealand people as well? Like pretty much exact same thing, or?
Well, because they had a treaty, so they agreed that the land could be used by the Europeans. So they were compensated way back at day dot for that land.
But I also remember from the New Zealand one, they also got like misheard from the other. There was like two different treaties, and I can't remember exactly how it went, but
they still, do you know what, Cope? They still got a raw deal, and we were talking about this today as well. So it was a treaty, and the treaty meant that there were less massacres and killings over fighting for land, because the New Zealand, the Maoris did cede the sovereignty of the land, the ownership of the land. They wouldn't have used the word sovereignty. That's a European word. So that meant that the Maori had agreed that the Europeans would come and they would use the land and they would sell the land. And this is just my personal opinion, I don't think that treaties for the Maori, and like you suggested as well, the Native Americans, because they had a different view of how land was used and not bought and sold, I don't think that they fully understood that it probably worked in the favour of Europeans. But it certainly did in terms of comparing having a treaty and not have a treaty, just basically on massacres and deaths. It certainly made a difference there. Because there was a treaty, it also meant that from that treaty onwards, any breaks in that treaty from the government or individuals could be legislated and fought against. You know, there was sort of a law there for people to say, hey, you cannot build that particular thing there, or you can't cut that down. Even though we said that you could use this land, there's still an understanding that the Europeans know that it was Maori land. Whereas in Australia, that was never the case, because it was terra nullius, land that belonged to no one. Any other thoughts? They're not right or wrong. This is all, you know, I mean, it's based on, you know, research that I've read and all that sort of thing, but it is my opinion and how I think it sort of panned out. And it would be interesting, I think, to see if a treaty was signed, whether any of that would come to fruition. I don't think it would. I think it would be more of an acknowledgement and a moving forward for the community as a whole in terms of Australia.
I also feel like that, like I could be wrong, but like Australian Indigenous Aboriginals are more connected to land compared to like New Zealand and Native Americans. Like obviously they still have to live off the land, but I feel like we're more spiritually connected to it.
I was going to use
the
same
I think
word
that's
as well.
why it's more of an issue.
Yep. Yeah. And probably I think especially with Native Americans, we could see more use of the land in an agricultural sense. Whereas just depending on what you read, Aboriginal Australia probably has less of, you know, like that staying in one place and participating in, you know, agriculture as we see it today. Bruce Pascoe has interesting thoughts about that there is evidence that Aboriginal Australians did participate in agriculture. It just looked different to Europeans. So yeah, definitely terra nullius, totally wrong. There were people here before we were here, for sure. And as you can see in this middle section here as well, there's ongoing discussions about constitutional change in terms of looking at signing a treaty. So the Hawke government said, yes, elect us, we'll sign a treaty, that'll be great. We still don't have a treaty. and Hawke was in like when I was young, so old, long time ago. So usually it does revolve around elections. They start, you know, coming out with these ideologies about treaty, but it never comes to fruition. So, you know, you guys can be noisy about that. We can continue to be noisy about that, and hopefully see what that means for Australia. All right, next one. Sorry, lots of discussion about that one because I find that one really interesting, treaty and not having a treaty, and looking at countries that have a treaty and whether that was positive or negative for those people. All right, sovereignty, because it is a word that I do throw around a little bit. And I just wanted to check that we all knew exactly what it meant. What it means is that if I have sovereignty, I have unlimited power over a country. And it means that a country has an independent authority and a right to govern itself. So that's most countries in the world, unless they're really doing a bad job and someone else will take over. So Aboriginal Australians fit this definition before we arrived. So Aboriginal Australians had unlimited power over their country, and they had the authority and the right to govern themselves in their own way. And that looks really different to Europeans. And that's why it probably didn't sit well with them as well. So that sovereignty was stripped as soon as terra nullius was declared, because you can't have power over a country if that country doesn't have any people, if it's land belonging to no one. So those two things can't fit together. So sovereignty is oh wow, can you tell it's been a big day? Sovereignty is stripped as soon as terra nullius was declared. The international example here is that the Maori people have maintained it. Even today, they have representation in Parliament and sea rights. You will often see when the national anthem is sung in football games, etc., that they do sing Maori and English. So can you also see that I did copy and paste all the boxes so that's got the same mistake. Promise to fix all. So sovereignty is being able to run your country, unlimited power over your country. Even the same heading. All right, last one. Self-determination. This is one that some people have come across in their major projects, not a lot of you, and one that we've touched on briefly in year 11, but not a lot yet. And this is a process whereby a country, or in this case, a people or an area, determine its own statehood and forms its own government. So when we're referring to self-determination in terms of Aboriginal Australia, we're often referring to Aboriginal communities being able to run themselves, be in charge of what happens in their communities, how government funding is spent, how government payments are delivered, and a really good example of self-determination, or in this case, the lack of self-determination, which is why this was so controversial. I don't know if you guys remember, probably a little bit over 5 years ago in the Northern Territory, the government decided that a lot of parents were spending their welfare payments on alcohol, and other things that weren't great for their children and weren't getting their children fed. So the government actually took their welfare payments and put it on a card, and that card could only be used for food and beverages that weren't alcohol. And obviously your first initial reaction thinks, oh yeah, well, if these kids aren't getting fed through the money that the welfare system actually exists for, then that's fair enough, that should happen. But it's like a band-aid over the problem. So, and it's a complete crossing out of any sort of self-determination, which, you know, is a human right. And you're going to look at human rights this week and tell me all about them. So keep in mind self-determination. The other example, like we were sort of using today, that there might be, and there would be, parents up in the Northern Territory in these communities where this decision was made, that were using their welfare payments really wisely. They might just be purchasing a bottle of wine on a Friday night. They no longer have the opportunity to do that. They are a full citizen of a country where the rest of us can choose to do that if we want to, and that right was in fact stripped from them. So it's not showing justice. Yes, it probably did fix for a short time the problem of alcohol within some of those communities and children being cared for. It probably did do that in some situations, but it flies in the face of human rights and self-determination. So that's an example of where self-determination has been taken away from people quite recently. So what have I written here as another example? It was not government policy till the 1970s, so not that long ago either. But as I said, even though it's government policy, it does still get a little ignored at times with the government trying to do the right thing. But again, that's that paternalism, you know, that wanting to be this parent figure that can come in and fix everything. So yeah, the self-determination is a vital part of the community to be sustainable as well, to be able to learn how to use those things and for the government to supply the tools for those people to be on an even playing field in making those right choices, not just taking the choice away from them altogether. The other thing that came out of self-determination, and all you guys will have one of these in your local area, and that is our AMSs, our Aboriginal Medical Services. So they're funded from the government, but the Aboriginal board and body that run them all must identify as Aboriginal. So it is that self-determination of Aboriginal people running this kind of thing. They're a government, I know the example says government, but it's sort of a body or a board of anything that is run by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal people. The international example is the American Indian movement, which I find, you know, that we're often said as teachers to not refer to Native Americans as Indians. That term was given to them because colonizers seen they had dark skin and they thought from the subcontinent of India. We know that's not true, so it is sort of deemed a derogatory term. However, it's been used in this context by First Nations people, so we use it in that context again. So got a small child at the door, but it gathered momentum like probably a couple of 100 years ago and the focused on protection and treaty rights. Oh, you've got to see what it's wearing. Sylvie, come here really quickly. Come here. All right, these, I've got two things. I just want to show everyone your lovely outfit. Come here really quick. Okay. Ah, you're a griever. Say hello. And goodbye. Bye. I've got the little bit in the way. There we go. All right, so I've got this example and I've got 4 little clips that also show this in a similar way. Okay, so we all hear this word equality and we think, yes, we all need equality. Everyone must have equal access to everything, and that will make society wonderful. What that does, though, is assume that everyone needs the same support. So you can see here, and I know this really simplifies it, but to me, this helps me understand it and remember it. That everyone will benefit from the same support. So they're getting equal treatment. It's equality. Equity. Okay, so if we've got equity in a society, everyone gets the help that they need, depending on, I guess, their disadvantage in terms of accessing a particular part of society. Okay, so that action is sort of like a positive action. This sort of is fairly neutral. Everyone gets the same thing and we try and drag everyone up at the same time. Doesn't matter where they're starting at. We sort of give them the same and assume that everyone will end up in the same place. We can see here this little dude still can't see, even though he was given the same opportunity as these other 2 lanky ones. All right, justice. And this is where I was touching on earlier, that justice doesn't just mean in this context, you know, going to court and getting justice for someone that's wronged you. You can see that the inequality is addressed by getting rid of the barrier. So no one needs these supports or these handouts and welfare, because the barriers that were stopping them from participating in society were removed, rather than giving them the tools to jump over the barrier. Does that make sense? So the cause of the inequality is addressed, which was what I was referring to in the last slide as well, about the self-determination, rather than giving the card with the money on it that you can only use for food. Maybe have a look at why people in that community are accessing and using alcohol in a really unhealthy way for them and their families. Okay, so that could be an example of this one here as well. So the barrier within the system, or the systemic racism in this case. So this isn't a particular Aboriginal context image. This is equality, equity, and justice can be applied to any sort of society anywhere in the world, whether they're Indigenous or not. So the barrier being removed is the justice, getting rid of the cause rather than the symptom. Okay. The next slides are, like I said, really similar, but I'm putting both just in case it clicks better with the next one. All right. So inequality. This one didn't really show the inequality before here. It probably would have been her being able to see only a little bit of the football happening there. So you can see here, we've got lots of apples on this side of the tree. And yes, it's an apple tree. We're thinking of it as an analogy, okay? Even if we think of it outside of the Aboriginal or Indigenous lens, we can think of this as, first world countries, third world countries. Okay, there's just not enough there to go around to start off with, let alone it just falling freely into people's laps. So inequality, we understand that there's an unequal access to opportunities and resources, and, sub out any word there really, and you've got inequality. Equality, like the first slide as well, we just give everyone the same thing to be able to now, instead of waiting for things to fall, we can jump up on the ladder and pick them, and pick however many we want, because we've got all this access to them. But the ladder in the bag isn't helping the people that didn't have the access in the first place. So equality, giving everyone the same thing and expecting them all to reach the end game at the same time, no matter where they started. All right. Equity is understanding that, okay, this side of the tree was a little taller than the other side. This is going to need a taller ladder. So that this person is feeling some equality in this situation. So now they're able to get the apples or access whatever part of society they need to access to have a full and plentiful life, but they needed that bigger ladder. Okay, so the suppliers of the ladders, most of the time here in this case, it's the government. We can consider that the ladders are different programs put in place. So this person needed a different program to access the same type of services because there was a different barrier there for them. Okay, that creates equity if we're giving people customized tools and programs and options to get to the same place. But this is where we want to be, and this is what we're talking about this term, this social justice. Fixing the system so that it doesn't matter what sort of ladder you have, it doesn't matter whether the tree's laden on one side or not, because we've fixed the problem, not the symptom, if that makes sense. So that now what we've done is made sure that our tree's really straight. So we've pulled the tree over here, we've worked, so this is legislation and societal changes, pushing the tree up so it's straight, it's leaning more towards this side, so both people have that access. And we've fertilized it and made it grow on both sides. So we've put the effort in initially to make sure that we don't have to have these different tools for everybody because we've got rid of the barriers. What do you guys think of those analogies? Does that make sense? Or are you going, why is she talking about apples?
No, I understand what you mean.
Does it help?
Yeah.
Yeah, the pictures really help me. They help me still to remember it now. And these are pictures I've used for a while. So
Well, I have one that for business with like money and knowledge and that, with the same analogies for that.
It's so helpful, isn't it, to get it to sink in? Yeah. All right. That kind of is we're nearly finished the sort of talking lesson for tonight. I just want to run you through, I sent you out an email, and I'm hoping that you've signed up for this one. This is a link to that webinar. They're happening in November, and there's 3 or 4 of them, so you can pick a time and day that suits you the most. If you haven't clicked on that link in the email that I sent, I think maybe at the start of this week or end of last week, please jump on that and sign up for one of those. It's not something that I'm running. This is something that the State Library's running. I'd also suggest, while you're on their webpage, to sign up as a member. It's the library's in Sydney, but you don't need to be in Sydney. It's really, most of their resources are online. And being a member and being able to type in that little member into that login just opens up a plethora of information for you to access for this assessment, but for all your other schooling stuff as well, and further studies if you decide to do that. So do jot down, I've only said jot down once tonight, do jot down that to sign up for the State Library as a member, so membership for the State Library. The other thing, when I was sharing this webinar in my teacher Facebook page, as you do, the lady that's actually running that webinar said, hey, do you know that we also have this guide? We've just released it. So this is a brand new Aboriginal Studies guide to help you with your major projects. So the State Library is all about research, all about how to do that properly, about accessing what you need to access. At first, when I got into this page, I'm like, oh, it's a bit hard to work. Like, this seems very vague and general, but it's all up in here. So if you click through here and start to look through some of these examples, so I've got some examples there. They've only got 3. I'm hoping I might send some of my old ones to her. She might put them up there, but it breaks it down into all the sections that you might find handy. So resources for you to go to and click on. So I would really suggest going through this whole page, and that might be something that you write in your logbook. Access the State Library page, signed up as a member, and looked through finding information and what they had available on there. Decided I could really use the journal. About this one's really handy in format. I used that one all through uni, so it's journal articles written by not researchers, professors, and different people that are, you know, in that game. And there's lots of really interesting stuff in there. So you can see there's actually the Aboriginal History Journal, and they've gone down and put all the journals that might be handy for your research. So this is particularly where you'll find a lot of that secondary research to synthesize with all your primary data that you're going to collect as well. So I was really excited. Yep, teachers love this stuff. I was really excited when she wrote back and said, hey, we've just finished putting together this resource. Please jump on and have a look. So I haven't even gone through this whole thing yet, but it does look amazing. So please, when you are looking through this PowerPoint on your style page, make sure you click here, and that's where we just were, the major project guide. Finally, the last thing I want to tell you for today and tonight, not even 45 minutes. Remember to write in your process log every 2 days. This is twofold. You have to do it because it's worth a big chunk of your marks, but more than that, it keeps you on track, and it's a really good way to make sure that you don't sort of put your major project aside for 2 or 3 weeks because you think, end of term 2, I've got this, miss, don't worry about it. It's not going to work like that. You really need to be checking in with yourself, and therefore with me, if you find any hiccups or speed bumps that you get to. And the best way to do that is just, even if in your process log you say, like I said, just have a look through the State Library page, found this article, I think it's going to be really awesome, and cut and paste the link that you can come back to later. It can be as simple as that, but it's really, really important that you keep writing in your process log or your portfolio or whatever you feel comfortable calling that document and that process. Okay. Also, and I probably should have given this an exclamation mark as well, I contacted our CSO here, the Lismore Diocese, which is who runs the online education committee, and asked them, beg your pardon? I love you too. Good night. Good night? No, you're just saying that. Okay, bye. So professional. I said, look, I know some of these guys are producing, they're producing artwork, or they're producing textiles, they're producing dance, all these type of things. Some of them aren't, and that's totally fine too. But the ones that are incurring costs, I wonder whether we can cover some of that and reimburse them. And they said, yes, we can. So I was really chuffed that they did that for us. So if you have any expenses that you incur up to, like I threw the number out there, about $150 each, and that was approved. So up to that, and it doesn't have to be that whole amount, so don't feel like you've got to go out and spend it, but just really making sure that you guys, I guess, had the best opportunity to do the best job you could without any sort of monetary worries or barriers getting in your way. So hopefully that's good news for you, because I was really excited about that. And please let me know. It'll be the sort of system where you'll supply the receipts and then we'll reimburse it from there, a little form, all that fun stuff, logistical stuff. So that's how that will work. So please, if you do have any expenses, keep the receipts. And keep asking me lots of questions about your project. I really do enjoy hearing them. I have been a bit slow to reply this week. That's because of the school closures and all COVID and all the fun things. But please do keep sending them through, even though we're not covering your major project in class until 1 week at the end of this term. You are still working on it in the background. Okay, you're still working on that, on your process log, on contacting people, on looking at the state library for information that connects with your focus question. So that is where we're at for now, week 4. Your style page, I'll open that up. That'll be up and running. We're looking at the same thing that we've just talked about: citizenship rights, sovereignty and treaty. So first of all, we're going way back to human rights, looking at some definitions, some of the ones we've just talked about, and then heading into a few other bodies that are in charge of citizenship rights and human rights, and then looking at some examples from your textbooks. So it's okay if your textbook's at school, you don't need to get it done tonight or anything. And then I have included our little analogy in here again, just to get you thinking a little bit about giving me an example of this analogy in the real world. Okay, so where for each picture on there could be a process of Aboriginal Australia, or if it works better for you, you could use any other minority group, but I'd rather you focus on Aboriginal Australians. And you could bounce ideas off me if you need to, but really this one's just to get you thinking about where you could see people giving the same thing, thinking they're going to end up in the same place, or then giving different tools, but getting rid of that barrier altogether where that might have happened as well. So if nothing comes to mind for you, that's okay. You can do a little bit of research around that as well, or talk to your mentors or your AEWs at school, and just see what you come up with. This is more of a get your brain thinking type of question at the end. So, and you might come across things you can include there as you're doing some of the other work for the week. So I will pop the Zoom up there. I will pop this recording and your PowerPoint up there, so those links are there for the State Library, and you are done. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
That's good. Okay, get going. Any questions?
No, I'm pretty good.
All good. Okay, beautiful. Love to hear it.
Yeah,
Dee, you're all good?
Yeah, I'm all good. Thank you.
All good. That's right. Have a wonderful night, guys. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll have a look at the Zoom, see if a different time suits. And all you people that didn't come need to be here next week.